midst of a transfer window, very quiet transfer window, and because of that, I think we've decided not to go for a transfer topic because nothing's really hit the headlines over the last few weeks. And if you're watching, you'll obviously see we've got a guest, Alex Harvey, who works at Sheridan's with Daniel Geey, and the reason, Daniel, that we're going into more legal matters this week is because Kieran Trippier has been in the news, as well as Edison Cavani a few weeks back, and we thought it'd be an interesting topic. It's one I'm saying in the preamble before we were speaking, before we come on air. I'm quite interested in this topic in the area that what governing bodies can regulate, can and can't regulate, and where do they reach. So Alex is the expert, and he's going to shed some light on it for us.
Yeah, no, very interesting one. And there's been a few cases and matters over the last 2 or 3 weeks, I guess. The one side of Christmas and the side of Christmas with Cavani and the Trippier matter. And it kept us busy in a way, just for reading through for the significance of it in different ways. Because, before getting into the detail, the wider picture is that, players, and we'll talk about it in a little bit of time, can get involved in lots of different difficult disciplinary matters, especially with VAR, referees were dealing with particular matters, but as significant as well, and it's a big part of our practice to a degree, is the whole compliance piece from an off-field perspective. And it's something that Alex and myself and the rest of our team have been involved with across lots of different sports. And that's effectively what happens when a player tweets something they shouldn't, put something on Instagram like could have done. And specifically in this case, there's been issues. Daniel Sturridge was one a little bit of time ago where he was given suspension for matters involving a potential transfer away from Liverpool, and it was the same with Kieran Trippier. And the really cool thing, generally, I say cool, is like you said, where you're interested in things. All of the matters are available to be able to read, so you get so much really interesting detail in the case. This one was, I think, about a 50-page case, which went into quite a lot of detail, and Alex will bring us up to speed, but it's got a lot of quite interesting nuances. So Alex, very briefly, or as much detail as you want to give, I think everyone would be interested to know sort of why and why this came around, and why it can potentially get players into such particular and potential issues.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on. I guess the reason why it kind of came about, firstly, is with the FA's betting regulations, they have pretty strict rules in place about what players can tell their friends, their family about not only kind of transfer activity, but stuff like whether they're picked for matches. And the reason why the FA has these rules in place is just to protect the integrity of the sport. So for Kieran Trippier's example, his came about through his transfer from Spurs to Atletico Madrid in, which I think summer transfer window of 2019. And what happened was he was basically sending texts to his friends on certain WhatsApp groups and just individual WhatsApp messages to his mates about his transfer, and they were asking him about whether it was going to happen. But what was probably the most important part of it was the fact that Trippier knew, or should have known, that they were going to place bets on his transfer. So some of the text messages from his friends were things like the betting odds of the Athletico transfer. So they were saying things like, "Oh, 6-1 odds. Shall I put it on?" And Trippier would reply saying, "Oh yeah, it's going to happen," or I think he used the phrase "lump on," which people refer to put the bet on. So yeah, under the betting regulations, what they essentially say is that you cannot provide inside information, which is information that as a result of your kind of place in football that's not already out there in the media. You can't provide that to people, and if you do, and they then put a bet on it, then you'll be in breach of the regulations. There is, importantly, a defence which says that if you had no reason to believe that they were going to place a bet, then you won't be in breach of the regulations. So, for example, if I was a professional football player and I told my best friend and my parents that I was going to move to Liverpool, they would, and then they went and put a bet on that happening, I wouldn't be charged, or I'd have a defence to a charge from the FA if I couldn't have known that they were going to place that bet. So if I had no reason to think that they were going to go and put that bet on, I'm not going to get in trouble for that. But as I said, in Trippier's case, the issue for him was that his friends had been kind of discussing odds on that transfer move happening. So Trippier really should have known better and should have known not to provide them that inside information.
And the interesting thing as well, Omar, that from when I read it as well, and I know Alex has spent quite a lot of time prepping and thinking about answers to particular things, is there were actually quite a few FA charges that weren't proven, that the actual regulatory commission dismissed. But in the end, there were quite a few that were proven. And then one of the issues actually became the sanction, proportionality of the sanction, and how significant and substantive it needed to be. And that's actually when we got into subsequently some quite novel issues. So Alex, would it be possible just to shed a little bit of light on what the sanction basically was and the sort of wrinkles in the system that have happened as a result?
Yeah, sure. So the sanction that the regulatory commission decided to hand down was a 10-week ban from all football activity, and I think it was a £70,000 fine. And when they gave the sanction, they actually interestingly drew kind of similarities with the Daniel Sturridge case, which happened, as you mentioned, I think a year ago or a couple of years ago. And he was banned for, I think, 3 or 4 months. And the commission in this case said that Trippier had acted essentially better than Sturridge had. He'd shown remorse for his actions, and he'd also handed in his phone to the FA for them to look through his WhatsApp messages, and all of those kind of helped Trippier in his sanctions kind of severity. But they did still give him a 10-week ban, which I think the dates were the 22nd of December until the end of February 2021. And what's kind of transpired since has been a bit of a regulatory minefield, because essentially the FA, as the English governing body, does not have jurisdiction to apply their sanctions internationally. They can only apply it within England. So what they had to do after the commission had handed down this sanction was to apply to FIFA, the international worldwide governing body, to ask FIFA to give the sanction worldwide effect. And FIFA quickly came back and said, yes, we give it worldwide effect. So everything at that point seemed fine. The 10-week ban was in place and it applied worldwide. So Trippier was banned from playing in Spain for Atletico Madrid. Atletico then did something which I think the FA were not expecting, which was they applied to FIFA to have the worldwide effect of the sanction essentially disapplied. So they weren't appealing against the FA's ban per se. They were just appealing against the worldwide effect of the ban. So the ban continued in England, but in reality that had no effect because he wasn't playing in England. And Atletico appealed to FIFA, and FIFA said that pending them basically looking into Atletico's appeal, they would suspend the suspension. So they would not give worldwide effect to the suspension. So that means from the period of, I think, the 22nd of December up until a few days ago when FIFA gave its decision, the worldwide effect of the ban essentially was not being applied. So Trippier was, yeah, exactly. He was free to play for Atletico during the early part of January. FIFA then came back, I think, on a few days ago, and said that they were rejecting Atletico's appeal, and that the sanction was therefore being given worldwide effect again. It's now transpired, I think, a few hours ago this afternoon, that Atletico have now taken it to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is the kind of final appeal body that they can apply to appeal again the worldwide effect of the ban. So it will be interesting to see kind of what the effect of Atletico's appeal in CAS is, and also whether the CAS decide to suspend the worldwide effect pending that appeal. Because if they do, then we'll go back to the same position that we were in a couple of weeks ago, which was the ban's continuing in England, but it's not applicable in Spain.
I have to say, Alex, it's not very often that I see Omar somewhat perplexed.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, because I must admit I hadn't followed it that closely. I'd seen kind of appeals on headlines and so on, but really interesting. And obviously, presumably, there's no real precedent for this, where we're obviously dealing with a player kind of moving internationally. So the FA obviously applied the initial ban, which was I suppose validated by FIFA as a worldwide ban. How far can the FA reach with something like that? Because obviously, I suppose this involved an English bookmaker and one English club and an English player. If it was Trippier moving from Atletico Madrid to, I don't know, Espanyol, would they have the same reach and remit? Could they decide to kind of place any sanctions based on that?
Alex, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. So unless Dan wants to jump in and say to the contrary, I don't think the FA would have jurisdiction over that particular matter, because that would be Trippier moving from a club in Spain to a club in Spain whilst he's in Spain. So I think they basically only have jurisdiction over players that are playing currently or playing for an English club at the time that the charge is brought.
Exactly.
And if he was moving back to Spurs, let's say, from Atletico, is that a grey area?
That's the interesting bit, because the nuance at the moment is it's quite an outlier for the FA to be trying to enforce a sanction on a player that is no longer within its jurisdiction.
Yeah,
it doesn't happen very often. The one time that people might remember from a few years back, which I wrote about in Done Deal a bit, was when Suarez was banned by FIFA for the Cellini bite, and then he subsequently moved to Barcelona. Mm-hmm. If you remember at the time, that ban was basically given worldwide effect, but it was effectively given worldwide effect by FIFA in a way through its own disciplinary body, if I remember correctly. The interesting thing here, which adds that nuance, as Alex really, brilliantly set out, was the issue that the FA had is that there was actually a subsequent second hearing, because the FA said, well, hold on a second, if FIFA have effectively suspended the sanction pending the outcome, our suspension is ticking away, which means that if we've only got a set time frame to be able to have them suspended up until the end of February, but effectively FIFA has suspended that time period, that should continue on post when the original suspended period should have commenced. And really interestingly, the end of that subsequent decision by the FA Commission was that that they didn't have that power to elongate, even based on FIFA suspension. And even if they did have the power, they wouldn't have elongated. So again, the sort of really interesting point now is, without wanting to confuse matters or complicate matters even more, is that CAS may actually suspend the suspension again, pending the substantive hearing that they have at CAS. And by the end of that period, it may actually be that the 10-week initial period has run out, which means that actually Trippier would be allowed to then play whilst the ban of the ban takes place, and then actually from the FA perspective is suspended. So in a way seems little disincentive for Atletico to try and elongate out the CAS process for as long as possible, because it means that they can retain the availability of Trippier. Now, to your point, you're exactly right. If he transfers back, one of the queries or one of the points that the FA Commission actually mentioned in their most recent point was that might be detrimental to Trippier's chances of then making a move if they were to stretch the suspension even more widely back into what might be the jurisdiction that he comes back into effectively. So it's one that I don't think the FA foresaw. It's one that Atletico have actually, in a positive way, and their lawyers gamed very well, is the truth. And actually, I think it will be, and I'd be interested in Alex's thoughts on this, I think the FA are likely to change their own rules to give their regulatory commissions the ability to be able to do that as a result.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised because, like you say, when the FA challenged they challenged FIFA's decision to suspend it. Oh no, they what they did was they asked the regulatory commission, like you said, to extend the dates of the ban so that essentially it had effect, so that they would come into effect when either he moved back to England or once Atletico's appeals had run out. And yeah, the commission said that they simply didn't have the power to do that. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they potentially amended their regulations to say that they can subsequently change the dates of the ban. But I think it is a difficult one because the commission made the point that if they were to do that and say this 10-week ban only comes into effect whenever you move back to England, no English club is ever going to look to buy Trippier again, or if they might do, but it would severely dissuade any English club from trying to buy him because they'll know that as soon as he comes back into England, suddenly this 10-week ban comes into play. So you can see why the commission didn't want to go down that route, even if it did have the power to do so, which it said it didn't.
Omar, can I ask a question there just on a more broader topic as well? Because some of the discussion that happened afterwards in the media and across a lot of journalists, and I was reading with interest quite a lot, was actually the efficacy, the attractiveness of betting markets involving player transfers. Is that, is there something to be said for trying for the football authorities or otherwise to put stakeholders to put pressure on bookmakers not to take those type of bets, because ultimately what is happening is it is maybe a little bit of fun, but ultimately is putting in place a lot of pressure on players from a compliance perspective. I know these are outlier positions, but is there something to be said for trying to restrict those particular betting markets?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I certainly won't profess to be an expert on this space, but my understanding of those markets. So players next club, or I think a very popular one is the next manager of Club X or whatever. The bookmakers don't have inside information on these. My understanding is that they put them out because they're a bit of fun. They're a talking point. They get them in the media. They might attract new punters to their platform if they can offer decent odds on them, and it's just a way of getting people in. It's not really a market that they're kind of actively trading as a means to kind of generate massive margins, which does make you wonder, okay, what's the purpose of these, and particularly in the context of this Trippier case. Yeah, I totally understand the kind of rationale behind the ban in terms of providing inside information. I suppose that the ban is as much around saying footballers do not get involved in sharing inside information, no matter what kind of sphere it's in. Don't get involved in sharing inside information. But I think there is a difference between this type of market and a match itself, where it might be a lineup, or when famously, I think it was like a Matt Letizia throw in the first minute that he obviously lumped on as well. I think there is a clear distinction there. Maybe that partly explains the kind of so-called kind of lighter ban of 10 weeks compared to several months that Daniel Sturridge had. But yeah, I think as a general principle, these types of markets, they don't impinge on sporting integrity. So A, you have to question the purpose of them being there at all. But B, I think in the context of the Trippier case, it feels to me like not a huge deal compared to obviously the big issue of match fixing, without wanting to get into kind of whataboutery around the betting market. But yeah, it's I'd be interested to know on kind of any kind of experts on the betting market listening in on why those markets exist.
I think if we switch just briefly, I guess, because I know we in prep we were talking about also discussing a couple of on-field disciplinary points that I know you wanted to raise, and as two lawyers have spent 2/3 of the time chatting about the intricacies of betting regulations and CAS procedural law. which might not be quite as attractive as maybe some of the points you're going to mention. But yeah, we were fascinated just at least in the prep about some of your maybe bugbears on sort of on-field disciplinary matters, if it's yellow cards and if it's red cards after the end of matches or those type of things, just as a means of some interesting blue sky thinking. It would be great to hear about.
Yeah, this opportunity to come in off a long run up here and kind of vent about suspension rules, which is such a small hill to die on in terms of things that are wrong with football or modern football or whatever. But yeah, I've got a real kind of bee in my bonnet around the way suspension rules work. I think the most obvious example is in World Cups and Champions Leagues and Euros, where players accumulate. They have softened the rules. It used to be, famously, it was Michael Ballack and obviously Gaza who missed out in 1990. I think it was Ballack in the World Cup final in 2002, who picked up 2 yellow cards in 4 matches and ended up missing the final, which, when you think about it, is an absolute travesty. That Ballack was one of the best players in the world at the time, and FIFA, in their showcase event every 4 years, have effectively decided through their rules not to have that player in the final. Pavel Nedved missed the Champions League final in 2003. Gaza potentially missing the final. I think. And no one would say that any of those players had been kind of dirty throughout the tournament and therefore deserve their bans. And I think it's kind of a bit of a nonsense that, and clearly the suspension rules didn't dissuade them from making a bad challenge or whatever. So there wasn't the disincentive to kind of avoid the yellow. So for me, those kind of rules aren't necessarily working. You see them in leagues as well, where you have 5 yellow cards accumulate over the course of the season, leading to a suspension, and they get wiped after a certain period of time and so on. But if you take the league ones in particular, you're talking about 5 yellow cards over 19 matches. A yellow card every 4 games hardly feels like a dirty player, kicking someone every game and getting punished. And so, there could have been a circumstance. I can't think of one that comes to mind in the last few days, but there could have been a circumstance with the Liverpool Man United game on the weekend where someone like Bruno Fernandes or Jordan Henderson or whoever missed the game because they happened to have received 4 yellow cards against Aston Villa, Man City, Crystal Palace, and Burnley over the course of the season, and had nothing to do with Man United. And that again would have been a travesty for showpiece game, probably the most watched game in the Premier League this season. And you're missing kind of 2 of the key players. So for me, that whole system isn't working in terms of player suspensions. It's not penalising players for dirty play. And so my solution to it is something around kind of repeat or consecutive offences. So if you have bookings in 3 consecutive games or 4 consecutive games, that kind of shows a level of ill discipline, repeated ill discipline that should be kind of punished, by the league. But yeah, the concept of 2 yellows over 5 games in a tournament, or 5 yellows over 19, I'm just not having it.
What about also, because we talked about it before as well, and obviously Alex, feel free to jump in too, is that idea of a red card that either was missed during a game or occurs quite close to the end of game or after the game's actually finished. So it doesn't really benefit the team that the player and the disciplined club has played against, but obviously then potentially benefits future teams to the disadvantage of that club that they've just played.
Yeah, I'll actually bring this back round in my answer to you both, because there's an interesting case I'm beginning to get your view on. But the one that springs to mind for me is Diego Costa, who got sent off against Arsenal probably like 5 or 6 years ago. Sorry, didn't get sent off against Arsenal 5 or 6 years ago. He I think headbutted someone during the game, but got away with it, and then retroactively was banned. Now, I suppose you'd have that less now with VAR, because VAR should be picking these things up. But there's still the possibility, I suppose, of bans after the game. And then Diego Costa got his ban after the Arsenal game, which was a big game at the time. Both competing for the league or the top 4. Arsenal don't see any benefit for it. They lose 2-0, I think it was, probably Drogba or someone, or probably Diego Costa getting the goals. And then a few days later, Diego Costa gets his ban. He serves it against two lesser opponents, less important games. These games are 6-pointers in many ways. They have big swings. And Arsenal see no benefit whatsoever, other than Chelsea being slightly less likely to win against weaker opponents. And so for me, the obvious solution is to have Diego Costa in that instance serve a part of his ban, all of his ban against Arsenal in the future, to recognise that Arsenal didn't benefit in the first instance. But kind of speaking of bans that go over, I remember when Paul Pogba, and I don't know if this is still the case, but I remember when Paul Pogba signed for Man United, he'd been sent off, I think, in an Italian Cup match at the end of the season, or Italian League match. And he actually had to serve 2-game suspension in English football, one of which I think might have been the Community Shield. I don't know if that's still a thing, but how joined up are these bodies? Like, is there anything that kind of connects, the FA to the Italian FA to on all these things, or is there a lot of kind of making up as it goes along?
I think, Alex, if I remember correctly, yeah, I think it can be the case that if you're serving a suspension in one league, depending on the type of competition that you've got the suspension in, it can cross over. It got me almost thinking about when players kind of can't play in particular games according to and then the strength of the competition in those subsequent games. And I'm changing topic completely now, but on the loan idea, so that you can't play against your loan or club, which would obviously, if the player is good enough, would obviously then be to the benefit of the loan or club. But then the loanee player can play against all of that loan or club's rivals to the benefit of the loan or club, which then incentivizes then the idea of the transfer actually happening to more than just the benefit of a monetary reward. So I found that idea of sort of teams strengthening or weakening as a result quite an interesting one too.
Yeah, was it Osama Saidi? I seem to remember scoring like a really important goal on loan from Liverpool against another top 40. I'll have to look that one up, but yeah, it can happen, and I think I think look, these are at the margins when it comes to sporting integrity, right? They're not. I don't think they kind of. No one sits there watching that competition going, "This is ridiculous. That totally undermines, the winner of the league or the top 4 team." But I think for the kind of purposes of fairness, that as a fan, you do want those things addressed to a greater or lesser degree, just because you'd like to think, particularly over the course of a league season, that things even out, even if they don't necessarily do so.
Yeah, I think that booking point's an interesting one that I've never really even thought about to that extent, which is, what's the point of the accumulated yellow cards? Is it simply for 5 disparate, what could be time wasting or accidental or whatever types of events? It's going back to the philosophy and the principle of why you're going to be suspended in the first place, really. So I think that's a really interesting one, which is, do you need to have yellow cards 3 games running in order to get a suspension, which in a way might be tougher to some, but actually then much more lax to others, depending on whether you're a striker that doesn't go near tackles or a destructive centre midfielder or centre back that has to make tackles and last ditch events at different times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there could be a rationale to split it out by position or something like that. But yeah, I think the general principle of players missing games for trivial things like time wasting, I just don't buy it, and I think it's a really easy fix there.
Yeah, 2 very last points as well. Aria mentioned something which is completely right, which was, if you remember the Courtois situation where he couldn't necessarily play, or didn't look like he was going to play against Chelsea for Atletico when he was on loan, but that obviously changed by a FIFA decision. And Philip Draper from LinkedIn's actually just said that at the Euros, apparently players will receive a 1-match ban after just 2 yellow cards.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's an amnesty or after a certain amount, but
I think it's after the round of 16 they've introduced it, so you get booked in the quarters and semis and you miss the final. But it's like, those 2 bookings again, one of them could be a mistake and there's no rescinding of yellow cards, and the other one could just be a time wasting or kick the ball away, and it just seems to me that if you're going to have, as I mentioned earlier, those examples of Nedved and Ballack missing big games, it just yeah, that has a bigger impact on sporting integrity than kind of banning a player for that in the first place.
Omar, we're at 7:30 as usual. It's flown by in most part because of Alex's a very interesting and detailed explanation on everything Trippier related. So Alex, thanks for joining us. Hopefully all the image rights money will be in the post for the appearance, and yeah, hopefully we can get you on again soon.
Yeah, thanks Alex, really interesting.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Omar, looking forward to catching up next week. We'll maybe try and get another guest on sooner rather than later, and we can have a think about some topics too.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks Dan. Thanks Alex.
Take care everybody.
Thanks.